Okay, so like I said, this is PHP Unit Getting Started workshop, getting towards the end here of the spring season. I'm going to take a little time off from the workshops during the summer, but we'll start a fall season kind of based on some feedback and what people enjoyed, and maybe what the more popular ones were, not necessarily based on registration, but based on kind of live attendee and feedback afterwards. So it's not just going to be the numbers. It's definitely going to be your feedback. So to that point, let me know on Twitter, let me know in Slack, send me an email, whatever. And also, don't be afraid to make recommendations for things you want to see more of. All this is kind of a test bed, but I enjoy doing these. I actually started doing kind of an add-on to this, a little more focused, with Refactor Fridays, which is like these bits. So I've been doing them every Friday. They're about an hour, but I'll kind of pick a topic or something that I focus on and do it a little more live. So it's a bit raw. These are similar, but I do try to create an agenda and maybe test a few things. Not test, but like, I'll kind of play it out, or rehearse is probably the right word. But these are a little more live. You'll kind of see my thought process, if that's something that you like a little more of. So these are out here as well, and I'll probably do these when I can during the summer. So they're not necessarily, again, they're not curated or kind of have a flow like these do. The Laravel ones here, they all build on top of each other. There's more of a schedule here, and they're kind of sequential, whereas these are one-offs. So, if there's a topic in here that you like, and again, I kind of post this a day in advance on Thursday on Twitter. Sometimes there's even a poll, so check these out as well if you're interested. These are, of course, free, but I bring them up also because based on some feedback here, I actually tweaked the description last minute for getting started. So this was really supposed to be a ground up kind of PHP unit, like here it is, and getting started with it, setting it up, installing with a composer. But I felt like that was a little basic. And then I also remembered that in some previous workshops by JMac that I started probably almost 2 years ago now, did these kind of one-offs. I actually had a getting started with PHP unit. This is only an hour, but if you're not familiar with PHP unit at all, you can definitely go back and check this out. And same thing, if we're going to use a little bit of Mockery today. So these two kind of already existed, and I didn't really want to do a 2 hour, as you can see here, both are about an hour. I didn't just want to do a 2 hour where I repeated these. That was maybe the original idea, but again, after some of these Refactor Fridays and after some live code, I just thought it would be better to show writing tests for something that exists in the real world. So I will try to do my best to bring us up to speed for those that maybe are still pretty new with PHP unit, because again, I don't want to completely change it, but I do want to, give it more of that realistic aspect. I think that's important with testing, because a lot of times you go to workshops with testing or a conference talk with testing, and there's all this high level crap, and you go back Monday to work and you can't test anything, right? Like you just don't get it, right? It didn't click. So I'm hoping by mixing and matching a little bit of the foundational stuff with writing brand new tests from scratch, from zero, but for a real world application, and kind of changing the code around, we'll get a better feel for it. So hopefully that sounds good. Shoot some feedback in the chat. And again, as always, feel free to ask your questions as you have them in the Zoom chat. I get that pretty real time, and I'll try to answer them unless I know it's something I'm going to cover in a few minutes, and then I'll be like, I'm going to get to that. So, but again, don't hesitate to send questions across, feedback. If the AV gets weird, if you need to see something again, even though we're remote, I try to keep it somewhat informal. So let's get started. Here is what the plan is today. So kind of the rough agenda is Laravel Shift is a application or a SaaS product that I run, and it's pretty popular within the Laravel community. For those that aren't familiar though, what it does is basically upgrade your project for you between the different Laravel versions. So Laravel and PHP are releasing versions almost every 6 months now. There's changes inside of there. There's method signatures that change. There's configuration options that change. There's new features to take advantage of. So Shift is this little automated bot that goes in and kind of looks for opportunities not only to do these types of things, but also, update your code for you. So of course you can run composer update, but it's one of those things where that's not really going to change your application code. So that's where Shift really kind of gets into that niche and does a good job of kind of fixing things up. So let's just take a quick look at this Laravel Fixer, just because I want to point out something that we're going to test for here. So I'm trying to give you the kind of high level picture of what we're after. So inside of here, we basically, this fixer basically goes in and does more of those things where it's making suggestions on how better to leverage the framework. And it does that by making these different commits. So a pretty simple one is adopting the coding style. This one's kind of nice, this leverage injected request object. So if I kind of bring this up, I'll just demonstrate kind of what one of these does. So it basically goes in and looks in the application and sees, for example, inside of Laravel, they automatically inject a request object to any controller or middleware or form request. And because of that, it makes sense to leverage that directly instead of kind of using some of these facades or helper methods. So it found a place where I was using auth check, but instead of auth check, I can just see if the user returns something. So if the request doesn't have a user or it doesn't have an authenticated user, it's going to return null, whereas auth check, while slightly more readable to be fair, returning true or false, is ultimately going to do the same thing. So I can swap those out with the fixer. And so the point here is that this is the type of automation that Shift does. Now, not all aspects of these are tested. And so that's what I want to focus on today. I want to focus on testing not necessarily the website as I've demoed in some of those Refactor Friday videos, but I want to demo testing one of these kind of automation bits. And it's something I don't, to be honest, don't have a lot of tests for. So I think there's going to be a good opportunity for me to not only drive this out with tests and demo PHP unit, but again, kind of like I've hinted at on Twitter and mentioned a little bit earlier, it's also going to be an opportunity for me to maybe rework Shift, the bot code base, to be more testable. Because even though it's pretty clean and easy to use from my perspective, I'm the only one using it. Again, not a lot of it has tests. So we're probably going to discover, much like we would in a real world application, that the code's not maybe super easy to test. So there's going to be, again, writing tests from scratch, but also changing the code to be more testable. And so I hope the combination of those two things lets you walk away with, some ideas on how you can test your own, legacy code bases. And according to Michael Feathers, a legacy code base is anything without tests. So it doesn't matter if I wrote it yesterday, if there's no tests, in his opinion, that's a legacy code base. So, and again, admittedly, I want to add more tests to, to Shift. So the website has a good amount of tests, to test that you can log in and all these very important things you can purchase a Shift, but not every single one of these shifts, there's, 30 of them, not every single one of them has full test coverage. And again, 100% test coverage is not the name of the game for me. I don't really believe in that. I think you can have 100% test coverage and still have bugs. So that's not my goal. So just kind of as a philosophy, I'm not interested in 100% test coverage necessarily, or like a report card of tests. What tests bring for me is confidence. I want confidence that I can go in here and make changes and I'm not going to break something else. That's what matters to me. And right now I don't always have that confidence in Shift. And as it continues to grow, excuse me, as the user base continues to grow, it's one of those things where I got to be really careful about making changes. What if I replace the wrong auth thing, right? By doing some willy-nilly, change, but I can't really, test that or feel confident that that change isn't going to break something else. And as the code becomes more complex and grows, it's going to be hard for me, again, as the only developer to kind of keep all that in my mind, at all times. So tests, again, allow me to, it gives me that memory, it gives me that confidence. And that's just why I really find their benefit. And again, I think it makes me a better developer as we see, because it's going to make us refactor the code. So enough philosophy, let's get into the code. So hopefully this makes sense. Again, feel free to fire off any questions if not. And just a reminder, I'll post these in Slack, but on YouTube, Workshops by JMac is the playlist. And again, you'll find this Get Started with PHP Unit and Using Mockery, where I really go over kind of the low level, very, very foundational aspects of just truly getting started with PHP unit, starting to use Mockery. So we're going to make the assumption that you're somewhat familiar with these. Again, I'll try to explain them as we go, but if you need a deeper explanation or you want to kind of follow along and get it off the ground, definitely go back and watch those 2 original workshops. Okay, so let's get into Shift. And the first thing I'm going to do is just be a good kid here and cut a branch. So we're going to call this testing workshop. And there's no specific feature, so we're just going to do that. So I got a clean branch to work on here. That way, if I don't finish everything during this workshop, I can switch back to master and kind of keep working on my other features for the day. And let's go back to PHP Storm. And what I'm going to bring up is the Laravel Fixer. And just to give you an idea of kind of how this is structured now, the Laravel Fixer is basically, what I have are these shift subclasses. So this basically implements shiftable, and the main beef of this is really this task. So every shift has a task. And kind of like we saw, one of those tasks that we saw in there was like this cruddy controllers, for example, was something. And this task basically, you can perform this task, it gets called automatically. So kind of how the shift engine works underneath the covers is it identifies which which shift it's supposed to run. In this case, it runs the Laravel Fixer. And then it goes in and returns a basically, class, all these different classes, the string representation of all these different classes, and kind of loops over them and performs those tasks, right? So that's kind of the high-level concepts and objects that go through there. So you can think of this as a registry. It basically, again, returns all these different steps that it's supposed to do, and it performs those steps. Now, again, some of these steps or tasks, as I'm calling them, they have coverage and some don't. So what we're going to do is we're going to find one that doesn't have coverage, that's not too involved, just to kind of get us started. So it's involved enough to make us change the code and kind of challenge us a bit for the purposes of this, but also not something that's so deep that we won't be able to kind of finish the test for it. So I'm going to click around through here for a second and find one. I think I found one last night, but I didn't I didn't write it down. So I want to find something that's maybe 20 or 30 lines, but gives us a good gives us kind of a good representation of something we can get through. So this mailables is pretty straightforward. Let's do this mailables one. I think it's a good candidate, first of all, because I noticed that it's shared. So it's not something that's specific to just the fixer. So I'll actually get more bang for the buck by testing this. And I think it has enough depth to it. It makes a little sense to kind of test this without getting too deep. And if we get far enough along with it, we'll test something else. So I'm going to leave this up. Let's close everything else. And I'm going to pull this down just because Zoom has got that little control bar up top and I don't want it to get in the way. So I'm going to close the chat, but again, don't hesitate to send something across. As you have it, it'll light up on my side, so I'll know that I'm missing a message. So let's take a look real quick at kind of this mailables thing. So what happens is, again, every task has this perform method. It automatically gets called by kind of the shift engine, just in that sequence that we saw from the registry, from the shift itself. And then so basically it goes in, it finds references to like this mail send. If it's empty, then it's going to return kind of no comments. Otherwise, it's going to do some logging. This is for my own analytics to improve shift. I talked about this if you're interested at last year's Laracon. It's called Laravel by the Numbers. You can check out the full video on YouTube. I also have a write-up on my blog post, or post on my blog. But ultimately, it's going to log a little event for analytics, and it's basically going to return a comment that says, hey, you've got some old mail sends, here's where they are and all these different paths, Shift found them, and you can take a look at the Laravel documentation, or in this case, the Laravel news article on how to convert to mailables. So this isn't a required change, so this is a little bit lighter compared to some of the other things like that request object one I demoed, where it actually is going to make a change for you. But again, those are a bit more involved. So I don't want to get caught in the nitty gritty of Shift. I want to be able to focus on the testing today. And again, changing the code so it is more testable. And I think this is a perfect candidate because it's not too many lines for us to have to understand all of the inner workings of Shift, but it's just enough to give us a bit of that legacy feel that's going to challenge us, again, to change the code. Because right away, for those that are familiar maybe a little bit with testing, you're probably noticing some things in here. It's like, well, how are we going to test that? That's a little weird. I'm going to get to all that. Let's start at the beginning, though. Again, I'm going to do my best to kind of go back. So I do actually have some unit tests that are in here. There's a bunch of tests that exist already, so let's kind of demo those. So these are pretty much just unit tests, though. They're very simple tests. So for example, inside of Shift, if we go look at that Laravel Fixer test, I have things to make sure that it's going to look in the right location. It's got certain naming and so forth. It's checking in a certain resource path. There's a certain version that it has to hold itself to a standard on. So these tests are here, and these are pretty straightforward unit tests, to be fair. I'm not getting a whole lot of confidence from them per se, but there are better tests. So for example, there's this versions test. This one's pretty nice. There's some comparisons to test that version numbers are higher than another using some of these helper methods that I created. And there's a whole bunch of data factories and so forth. So data providers, sorry. So we'll get to tests like these as well. So, but if you notice over here, there's no tests for those tasks right now. And that's what I want to remedy today. And that's what I think is going to push us to a pretty interesting place with Shift. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set up the directory structure for that. I like to have my test directory structure mimic my code directory structure. So those tasks live in a tasks, and then they're broken down similarly like shifts into, kind of what type of shift they are. Are they a Laravel shift? Are they a PHP shift? Whatever type of shift. So again, I don't have a task folder in here, so let's go ahead and make that. And we're ultimately going to make, what was it? This mailables analyzer. So we're going to make a test for this. So I basically want to make a tasks Laravel analyzer mailables test. And that's, again, not only mimicking the structure of my project, just to kind of give me some organization. That's like how I like to structure them. But also I'm following the conventions of PHP unit, which is that if you suffix the file name with test.php, PHP unit will automatically pick those up and run those, so you don't have to do a whole lot of like configuration. So I like to follow their conventions. So let's make a new PHP file. And in PHP Storm, I'm pretty sure I can actually just pass it a bunch of directory names and it will make it. So I'm going to say tasks, Laravel, analyzer, / mailables test.php. And we'll say OK. And if I did that right, yes, PHP Storm, tasks, Laravel, analyzer, there's that mailables test. And I've configured PHP Storm with command /, which is going to break that over to the right side. So I'm going to do a little split screen. And I like to do a split screen when I'm testing, basically just so I can kind of see the integration and so forth, especially when I'm doing TDD, because I'm going to be driving out what's on the left. Now, we're not really TDDing today because this code exists, so we're kind of going to do more of a sequential test. So, and I'll get to that. So let's namespace this. And I'm pretty sure, let me just make sure I'm following the same conventions as my other tests. So yes, I do namespace these. So let's just borrow this and we will change it up. All right, let's bring that back. Cool, there we go. So this is, what is it? Tasks, Laravel, analyzer. All right, that's the proper namespace. And then this is going to be a class, mailables test, extends test case, and that's a PHP unit framework test case. Now, real quick, if you happen to be running a very old code base and you need to run PHP unit prior to, I believe, version 6, they don't have the PSR4 convention. They still have PSR 0, but that's basically where you change these to underscores. So they don't have that /based path where their paths are like we created in PHP unit. They're still kind of using that old school underscore to denote where it exists. Hopefully everyone's running PHP 6. That would be, again, a pretty old code base. But for some reason, I don't want to prevent anybody from writing tests. You should write tests no matter what version you're running. So just keep that in mind. Otherwise, everything you're seeing here should be exactly should be able to be run on older versions of PHP unit. But just keep in mind that PHP 0 if you're running a PSR 0 convention if you're running an earlier version of PHP unit. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start writing some tests for this, and I think right away we're going to see that we have a little bit of an issue. So first thing we want to do is we want to write public function. And another convention in PHP unit is basically if we say something like, if we prefix any public function in here, it's automatically going to run as part of our test. So again, PHP unit's going to pick that up automatically. So let's just say something simple right now like test perform. And I'm going to stop there. And we're going to jump back over here. And we'll run PHP unit. And we'll see that I have what's kind of interesting. It's called R, which is a risky test. And basically what that's saying is this test did not perform any assertions. So I've made a test case, I've made a class, it's picking that up, but it's actually not, there's no tests or assertions inside of there. And because of that, PHP unit's gonna yell at us. So again, just for those that aren't familiar, dots are basically passing tests. You'll get these kind of W or R for warnings or risky tests, and then you'll get a red F for a failing test. So let's run just this test specifically. So if I pass any path to PHP unit, and I gotta pass it as a file path, not a namespace path. So let's do tests, Laravel analyzer, mailable test, .php. Oh, it's not finding that, why not? .php, oh, that's not it. Okay, hello. Cannot open, why not? Is that not the right location? Tasks, Laravel analyzer, mailables test. Why can't you, oh. I have my tests underneath PHP unit, my bad. PHP unit. What is wrong with you? Oh, live demos, you gotta love them. Oh, somebody's helping me out. Let's check the chat. PHP unit is executing in vendor bin, so you need, that shouldn't be the case, but we'll try it. I've run PHP unit from there before. Its script should be, yeah, there it is. I just have my path all wrong. There it is. Yeah, it's not relative. It actually runs from the root. My problem was my screen was lagging there. My keyboard was lagging. Whenever I record something with Zoom, it's like my laptop sounds like it's gonna take off. It's an airplane. So anyways, let's do this again. So there we go. We're just running this test now. So notice not all those dots. We got this risky test still. So we'll start here. We'll just kind of focus on this one. So what I want to do anytime I'm kind of testing legacy code is I basically want to kind of just, again, work very top down. So I want to just do kind of the simplest things and start testing different code paths. And so the first code path that I can see here is, okay, I'm going to call this find files. And basically if find files is empty, I should get an empty array back. So pretty straightforward. So let's do that. So test perform returns empty array when nothing is found. Now this is kind of a little bit of a gripe with PHP unit. I wish they had better naming here. Some people prefer like the underscore pattern where it's all lowercase. So you know you can do this perform returns whatever, you get the idea. Others don't like this test here. They like to do something a little more like behavioral. So like it returns, so you don't have to do that naming. So like it returns an empty array. They'll do sentences where it's like snake cased. So everything's separated with underscore. If you do it this way and you don't prefix with that test, which is fine, you have to annotate this as a test and it'll still pick it up. So let's demonstrate that. So it still picks up this empty test, or sorry, risky test, and notice that it found that name correctly. So whatever convention you'd like to do, I'm going to do the underscores just because these aren't strictly unit tests. They're a little bit somewhat more behavioral. And when they're more behavioral, my mind goes to kind of these spec type tests. I kind of learned, well, not learned, but I first started testing with Ruby. And as such, RSpec was a big one, and it followed this convention. So that's just kind of where my mind goes. So I'm used to it. So let's do that when nothing is found. Okay, cool. And so let's set this up. So basically what I want to do is I want to say subject equals new. I'm going to new up one of these like mailables here. So there it is. I don't believe I have to pass anything into it. Let's just check this task. So yeah, it's just an abstract class. So there's no properties on this thing. It just has that perform method. And I basically want to say actual. And I'm going to explain this wording here in a second. But let's do this, perform. So we're going to call, or not this, I'm sorry, we're going to do subject.perform. So we're going to call the mailable subject perform, there we go. And then we're going to make our first assertion. And again, I'm going to go back and test this out. So we're going to do assert same. And I want to say that something is equal to, so expected is first. So I expect that to be an empty array, and actual is what I got. So let me back this up a second and talk about what's going on here. So we basically create a new mailables, this thing we want to test, right? And then conventionally, you call things kind of subject. These are kind of terminologies of testing. So we'll say, you could call this mailables if you want. I just like to call it subject. It's the subject under test or soot. So subject here is what we're testing. It's going to return something. So, we're going to call some kind of method on it. In this case, very simple, just one method. But if you, again, had a class with multiple methods, you're going to call that thing and get some kind of actual result. And then we want to take that result and we want to compare it against something that we expected. And again, terminology there of actual and expected. And that's where we make what PHP unit and most testing frameworks call assertions. We're going to make assertions that, hey, this thing is that thing, or this thing equals that thing, or this thing's string length is this, or this thing's array count is this, or this thing returned a type of this object. So many assertions out there in PHP unit. There's hundreds of them. We'll cover a handful of them today. And I'll talk a little bit more about the ones I use once we kind of get this test running. So I've written a test now, pretty straightforward. Let's go back over here and run this again. And we should see some explosions. Okay, so this is probably not going to be clear what the issue is here, but the problem is that underneath the covers, this find files is basically trying to run. And because it's trying to run, it's using this base path. So if I go down and take a look at this find files, here's this base path, right? And we could have seen that where it says utility helper line 157. So the point is that it's actually calling into kind of this helper deep inside of the Shift engine to find those files. Well, I don't really have the files, kind of set up. I'm not going to have a mail send. So I could go down that path, and people would consider that more of an integration test. And there's value to that test. I'm going to talk more about that, but there's value to that test. But for now, I don't really want to have to set up, this directory structure where, it calls in and set up all these fake classes that have mail send, I set up all these fixtures, as you would call them in the testing world, these data fixtures. I don't want to have to do that. What I really want to do is kind of fake this thing, right, and be able to manipulate it. And so that would make this more of a traditional unit test where I'm isolating the pieces I want to test. I'm controlling that environment in a way so I can really kind of guide the code down a certain path. Now, some people don't like those types of unit tests because they're a bit contrived. And at the end of the day, all you're really testing is your exact implementation, which means that when you go and change your implementation in any way, your tests become maybe a little bit brittle, right? There's coupling, there's high coupling between your tests and your implementation code. Now, I don't really have a problem with that, especially in cases like this where I am kind of testing things at a really, really low level. I'm testing this perform method. But I think, again, a good balance makes sense. And at the end of the day, it's all about whatever gives you confidence. So if having a unit test and you feel confident that, okay, well, I've tested the shift engine separately on its own. I'm testing that I'm calling that, and there's kind of like some touch pointing going on. There's Feathers would call this again a seam that I'm kind of testing. I'm not testing kind of that things cross over. And then maybe someday if there was an error that I missed, well, maybe I'll write an integration test for that. So um, the point is that you have to determine what's going to, again, give you the most confidence for your application. I'm confident that that shift bit, the low level shift utility helper, to be technical, this class has got its own tests. So right now I'm confident that if I kind of just fake this thing out, that I can feel good that it's okay. As long as I know that I'm calling it with a certain thing, I know that it's doing its job. And so that allows me to kind of keep everything at a unit level. Now, again, sometimes that might not be enough. You'll have to make the choice. But today, I'm making the choice that this is okay. But again, some of you familiar with testing might have noticed this a little while ago. This is a static or seemingly static call. I'm not injecting this with dependency injection into the task class. Some people might expect to be more testable, that I would have, this kind of injected here, this shift object. And let's just initialize this quickly with PHP Storm. So with that, now I could construct this with some kind of like fake shift, right? And this would give me a hook into the system now where, instead of this being shift, this would be something like this fake shift, or sorry, shift, calls find files. Now I'm going to get a little griping from PHP Storm because it's not familiar with all that, but that would be a traditional way to test this, but this would require a major refactor. Notice this is an abstract class, so now all my tasks have to have this shift object injected. That's just not the way I built it originally, and I'll talk a little bit about why, but this would make the code readily testable. But how can I test this using what I have, right? I understand that dependency injection goes hand in hand with testing. This would help me out, but there's another way I could probably do this with my current code base that's a little less invasive. So let me just back this change out. And again, shoot questions across if you have them, but I'm going to assume that this is pretty straightforward. So I've adopted a little bit of what's called a facade pattern here. And this came, not necessarily out of Laravel. A facade pattern's been around, forever. But the point here is that I call this shift engine underneath the covers in kind of a static capacity. It's not actually static. If we go and look underneath the covers, it's calling this utility helper, which these aren't static methods. So if we go down and look for that find files, this isn't a public static function, right? So that's not actually how it's being called underneath the covers. It's actually a instance method that's being called. So underneath, what's really going on is shift itself is a facade. And that facade basically underneath the covers creates a instance of this utility helper. So it's a little bit of indirection, it's a little bit of abstraction, but what this affords me is basically the fact that the facade pattern affords me basically this pass that this looks like a static method, and therefore I can call it kind of from anywhere without having to inject things, because this is my core thing, right, of Shift. Like this has all of the methods that are helpful for the engine to kind of run. It finds files, it changes files, it makes commits, it does kind of everything. And some people, might gawk at that, but that's just kind of the nature of the beast of this code that evolved. And to the point, we can see why it's maybe a little bit of legacy. And maybe with tests, I'll change this around as we're going to see here in a minute. But this isn't all that uncommon. Again, some people, kind of turn their noses up at this, but it's not all that uncommon. If you're familiar with something like Carbon, which is a date-time PHP library, and I think it's spread to other languages as well, so it's not just PHP. But Carbon does this. Carbon's a very static, accessed kind of facade type pattern. You reference everything almost statically. You do carbon : : now or whatever. I think it's actually included here. So So I can do carbon, tomorrow. So real similar pattern, and everything, if you go look at carbon, everything is this huge file. I mean, what is this? 4,200 lines. So again, everything's kind of right here for you in this carbon kind of interface class underneath the covers. They're following a very similar pattern, but to the developer at a high level, they're accessing carbon in a very static way. And once they make a carbon date time object, then they're not referencing it that way. They're referencing maybe a date time object directly. But the point is that at a high level, carbon follows the same pattern. So again, some people gawk about the facade pattern, specifically how Laravel uses it and it's global and yada yada. It's not that big of a deal, folks. So let's demonstrate how to test this. Because again, in the real world, you might have things like this in a system. So let me get rid of this fake shift. Let's make sure we're still in kind of a runnable state. So everything's good. We still get this error back to where we were, where it's, again, trying to invoke this. So what I need is a hook to be able to say, okay, shift engine, I don't really want you to run this real thing. I want to fake you out in a way. And so again, we can take a page out of other frameworks who have kind of used the facade pattern and how they tested, again, particularly Laravel. And what we can do is we can do some kind of like shift swap. And what we can do is underneath the covers, we can make this swap pattern, and we're going to swap it out for a shift mock, right? And I'll just call this shift mock. And let's go ahead and initialize this. And I'm going to make this a mockery. Or where is this mock? Do I have mockery? Let's test to see if I have mockery. That's probably the first step. I do not have mockery, so it's not going to show up for us. So let's go get mockery. So mockery PHP, let's pull in their latest version, which I'm pretty sure is just 1. So installation, it says bring in dev master. That's interesting. I don't know if I like that. So let's do it the old-fashioned way. So I'm going to bring in mockery. And what mockery allows me to do is create these mock objects. And I know I kind of just used the term in the definition there, which is kind of lame. So again, sometimes we may want a way to fake an object and kind of put something in its place. And that's exactly what mockery allows us to do. It's a great little add-on library helper to PHP Unit. PHP Unit does have mocks built in, but they weren't always as great as mockery. They probably are now, like in PHP 8, but way back in like PHP 4 and 5 when PHP Unit was sorry, not PHP, way back in PHP Unit 4 and 5, when PHP Unit, really became kind of the de facto testing framework, mocks weren't as easy to deal with there. And so there was an opportunity for a different package to kind of do a better job. And so that's why mockery is still kind of prevalently used, even though, to be fair, PHP Unit does have a better mocking engine built in if you're not interested in using mockery. This is also, again, one of those YouTube videos that's pre-recorded. You can check it out to really get a feel for mockery and kind of get yourself that foundation. But we got mockery in here. I forgot to do required dev, so I'm just going to manually pull that down. And so now we should be able to say mockery, mock. Cool. And so what we're going to do is we're going to mock out this kind of, shift engine or shift interface. And we might have an interface that's built onto it. Let's check it out. So it implements utility. Cool. And so we can say that. We can actually mock out a utility interface. And now this is going to allow us to basically create a mock where we're able to kind of call things on it. And so let me just demonstrate this real quick. So we can do something like shift mock. We say should have received, some kind of call to some method. So we could say like find files, right? And so let's do something like that. And let me just comment this out because this isn't real code yet. So just kind of demonstrating what kind of mockery would do. So here's an example. So again, error messages in mockery, I think there's something to be desired. But the point here is that now instead of getting that base path, exception, we're getting a different exception here because I've kind of moved the code around and commented it. But just to get a feel for what mockery is doing, it's basically saying, hey, method find files for this mockery, utility that you made a mock of should have been called at least one times, but it was never called. So again, mockery gives us a way to kind of mock out an object. We can even pass it some type hinting, so it passes our code type hinting. If we have that, if we type into things in the code by passing this class, it's actually going to, underneath the covers, extend that class and kind of listen to it, spy on it, mock it out, fake it out, and track all the calls we made to it. It's not actually going to call the real thing in this case, in the case of a mock, but it's going to kind of do what we told it to do. It's going to do the bits of behavior, right, that we kind of want it to do through our integration, or sorry, our test. So the problem, though, is that we need to have this mock be used. And right now, there's no way to do that in our code. So what I want to do is, this is where we're actually going to change the code to be able to do what we kind of want it to do. So again, we could use dependency injection, but I think that's a much harder change in an existing code base than maybe doing something along these lines. So if you have some kind of like global static-y type class, some God class, these are all things that happen in the real world, as much as people, again, at conference talks, oh, well, you got to go change that whole class. Well, that's not very practical. So this is a more real world solution. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make, again, kind of taking a page, just like I took the Facade page out of kind of Laravel's book. Again, Facades existed well before Laravel, but Laravel uses them a lot, and one of the ways they got around it with testing was this cool little swap method. And so I'm just going to kind of borrow from their book. So what I'm going to do is let's bring in this Facade. Notice that there's no swap, so let's go ahead and add this method. Now I don't actually want to add it here directly to this Facade. I want to add it just a bit higher up in the actual Facade class. So I don't want to do it just in Shift. And so if we look at this Facade class, it's actually super straightforward. All it is just basically takes this resolved instance and it basically figures out, kind of where that happens. So when we ask for a Facade, everything gets passed through this static method, right? And we can see this down here in this call static. So anytime we call a static method, this is really the beef. Anytime we call something statically on a Facade, this underlining magic method in PHP is going to get the method name and the arguments that we passed in. And what that's going to do underneath the covers is this Facade class is basically going to say, hey, get the Facade object, get the instance of it. If there's not an instance, we've got an issue, of course, and then call that underlying method kind of dynamically and splat out the arguments. So it's basically just underneath the cover is going to call the instance method on the Facade root that we set up. And the Facade root is a little bit of magic here, but it's pretty straightforward. All it really does is create these two methods. It allows us to have a shift Facade accessor. Think of this like the key in the registry of Facades, and the instance in this case is what the actual object that should be created for that Facade. So this is just the key, and this is the value in our Facade registry. Pretty straightforward. Everything else inside of here is not really something we need to concern ourselves with, but we do need to concern ourselves with this new swap method. So I'm going to put this down here. And what we're going to do here is we're simply going to say, hey, that wherever, just like we do this setting up of the instance, where is that? Right here. Here we go. We are basically just going to, whatever you pass in, we don't really care with the type. I'm not going to type into it because you might want to pass in your own object or a real object, whatever it is. So we're going to swap in an instance. And basically, I'm going to do the same thing here. Instead of name, we need to borrow that, where is this? Get Facade. Where are you? Here you go. Sorry. No, it's not Facade root. Where does name come from? Name gets passed in. There we go. Facade accessor. Cool. So what we're going to do is, doesn't matter what you've set up in here. We're basically just going to override whatever instance in our resolved instances with the instance you passed in. So we're going to trust you know what you're doing. So basically, if you call swap, in this case, we're calling swap, we're going to override whatever's in the facade registry for that particular key, in this case, shift, with the instance that we passed in. And so now by swapping this out, we've effectively used this method to fake out the system. And you could call this, if you like, you could call this fake or whatever. Doesn't really matter, but this would potentially allow us to, swap things back and forth. So maybe we could do something fancy like return the old instance so we're able to kind of swap back and forth. I'm not going to do all that right now, but you get the idea of how we can just make one little simple method on here, on this, God class or the static class or whatever it is, to now be able to test it. So this is one of those little hooks that's going to help us out. So we swap this out now, and when we go back here, we run this test, we get an exception. It still didn't call find files. So let's see what's going on here. So we have 5 files, should have received, oh, well, we call that a little bit too high. So let's go back down here. And let's put this assertion at the bottom because this underneath the covers is actually an assertion. So we were making the assertion before we actually performed the perform call. So let's move this around and see if we're a little farther down the road. Okay, cool. So find files, but no expectations were specified. So again, this is another mockery issue. And the mockery issue here is basically that anytime you make a mock, you have to stub out all of the methods that are potentially going to be called on this. So this should have received is a nice little assertion, but we can actually change this up. And what I like to do instead is basically set this up to say, it should receive a call to find files. And I want to get a little more specific. So I'm going to say with, and I think you can say with args. And in this case, I'm going to pass in an args array of mail, mail colon send. And when we do that, I'm going to return an empty array. All right, and now when I go back, we're green. So let me bring up this and we'll slow down for a second. So I'm green now, meaning I'm passing. And so what we've done here is we've said, okay, go ahead and make a mailables, our subject, the thing we want to call, go ahead and make this mailables task. Mock out a utility class, an instance of a utility class, inherit all of its methods, follow along with its signatures and type hinting and so forth. So anywhere we type hint stuff with our utility interface, this mock is going to be able to be substituted in directly for it. I know in my code here, I basically am going to call find files with this mail send. I want to make sure that that happens. And when that does happen, that specific thing happens, I'm going to return an empty array. And that empty array is going to drive me down here where I ultimately return this empty array back. So I'm going to swap out the shift facade with our own shift mock. And at that point, I'm basically going to call or do the thing. I'm going to call perform on our mailables. And then I'm going to assert that what it returned was an empty array, was exactly an empty array. It wasn't an empty string or anything like that. And so that should get us that far, and that's why we're green. And we could do some other things like make sure, obviously it didn't return a comment, but we could also make sure like it didn't call log events or something, which we'll get to in a second. But I want to pause here for some questions because I know that was a lot and we're about halfway through here. So shoot any questions across in the chat and we will keep hacking away here if not, but I'll wait just 15 or 20 seconds to see if anything comes across. I know there's a bit of a delay sometimes. If not, give me a thumbs up or something so I know everybody's still here. Sometimes it gets so lonely over here. That's the only kind of lame thing about, a live or a remote webinar workshop. Can we use app container instead of swap method? Yes, absolutely. So if you are using some kind of container or inversion of control kind of thing, so an IOC container such as frameworks do, then yes, you wouldn't need to hack in your own little swap method. You could basically in your test case, you could say, okay, bind to that thing in the container, this mock. So it's the same exact concept. It's just that because again, I'm trying to demonstrate that sometimes when you have some legacy code, you might have to build in proper hooks for testing directly into your quote unquote, production code, right? So, when you don't have the dependency hooks, when you don't have IOC, inversion of control, when you don't have that kind of container, then yeah, you're going to have to maybe take some measures to kind of get deep into the code. And this, again, this shouldn't be something that scares you. This is pretty common, in fact. A lot of the times I'll see, especially in older code bases or different languages, people will create their own mock objects that do certain things, like physical child classes of some kind of other class, and that exists in their code, and they're able to kind of, again, inject that. Or they'll have, a test container that has all their different test bindings in there, and that gets swapped out kind of at test time versus run time. So point is, don't be afraid to put hooks in your code. Do the simplest thing that can possibly work. Obviously over time, I would want to move towards maybe dependency injection or IOC, but the point is that I also need to, practically work with the code I have today. I can't go off in a cave and refactor this for 2 weeks to make it dependency injection and all these other things, right? That's going to be a lot harder of a path than basically writing a one-line method that gives me what I need in the existing code. So yes is the short answer. Swap is basically what you could do with binding in a container. But the long answer, a little bit of philosophy, don't be afraid to change the kind of implementation code to allow yourself those hooks in an older code base. Okay, so let's keep playing on here. I do want to do one more thing, and this will kind of help us kind of recap that facade as well. I could actually do something real similar, and we could make an assertion here that log mock should not have received event, right? So it should not have been called with event. And we don't have this log mock, so let's just go ahead and initialize that. And I need to swap it out a little higher up. So let's do a log mock is equal to mockery, mock. So we're just gonna make another one for that log and give us just a bit of a tighter test, right? Just to make sure, I didn't end up in any other code path, again, if there were more. So this is a bit of a defensive test, but I think it brings me value to know that, it didn't get any farther in the code. Okay, so we need to swap this out as well. So what we can do is we can just say log swap. And because I put this in the facade class, it's super easy. It already exists. And we can just swap this out for the log mock. And again, that's why I put that higher up. And it is our shift facade. And let's just make sure this doesn't have some kind of analytics helper. Yeah, so there's nothing it implements. So in this case, I'm not going to worry about type hinting it or anything because it doesn't extend anything. I can just make a generic unnamed mock, if you will, here. So I could name it as a string. I could call this log facade or something. It gives you a little bit better error messaging, but there's nothing there. So let's break this code real quick. So I'm just going to move this up just to demonstrate that things fail. So sometimes when things automatically pass based on the code I wrote right away, I like to just go back and make sure it truly broke. In this case, it did. I get an exception. Method mockery log facade event does not exist on this mock object. Whoops. What do we want to call this? Oh, this is actually, what is this? This is so I made a mock. Let's change this to a spy to actually demonstrate both sides. So there we go. So E method event should be called exactly 0 times, but called once. So subtle difference here, but an important one, and I'm gonna talk about this. Basically, spy is a little bit different than a mock. So a mock requires you to say, okay, mock out this particular object and stub out these methods to do these certain things. So I'm making this fake thing, but it's a bit more rigid it's a bit more strict in the fact that you have to do a lot more setup. Mockery also gives you something called spy. And so spy doesn't require you to set up a lot of things. You don't have to set up any of the methods, in fact. You can just kind of spy on something that's already there. And mockery will simply track it and kind of return null, or yeah, I think it's null, in the event that it was called. So for something like logging events or analytics, a spy is a little nice because then I don't have to like go and say should receive or expects, or I don't have to create a lot of things. I can just spy on it and make really simple assertions after the fact. So unlike the mock where I actually want to, say, okay, well, you got called with find files with this argument and do this thing. If I'm not going to go down that road, if I'm simply just checking if something was called or not, spy is a little lighter weight and allows the code to kind of play on in a natural way. So be mindful though that without these assertions or anything, a spy again is just going to return null. So you want to make sure you're using mocks only in the event that you're actually kind of doing something with them, right? Just don't mock out everything. Like use the real thing as far as you can is the point I'm making. So if you can use a real object, if you can use the underlying system and it just kind of works, don't get too heavy with these mocks and swapping if you don't have to be. Okay, so we're back to green. Let's push on to this kind of harder code path here, right? And this actually shouldn't be too bad. So let's kind of make another test here. So we're going to say at test, and we'll say public function. It returns a warning comment for the found instances. Cool. And there is our new test. And we're going to do the same thing here. So just a little muscle memory. So we're going to do subject equals new mailables. And we're going to create the same shift mock. So I will copy some of this stuff, but I'm going to dump out I'm going to change up the should receive here, right? Because we want it to receive something else. And in this case, it's whatever we want to do to drive this path out. So we can see here that paths, so long as it's not empty, it's going to play on. So we could really return whatever we want. But ultimately, this gets sent to the comment. So I want to put some data in here where I can kind of make assertions on that later. So let's return, file1.txt and some path file2.txt. And that's good enough. So basically when mail send gets called, we should see play on. So we're not going to get an empty return. So let's keep going here. So we get down here, and in this case, we get actual. We're not going to make that assertion. We do want to make the assertion that we should have received event with, or actually, I think a spy has a different setup here. We need to bring in our log mock. So let's bring that in, log mock spy. And now, yes, should have received takes the method as the first parameter or argument and takes an array of arguments as the second. So in this case, we want to get found usages of mail send. So we're making sure that now log got called, or our log mock got called. And then ultimately, we also want to make some assertions on actual. So let's do that. So let's say this assert count of actual should be 1. Whoops, that was backwards. Again, it's expected count and then actual. So all the assertions are expected actual. Well, maybe not all, but most. And then now we could do something else. We could say something like, so we know that there's 1, so we'll just kind of play this down. We'll say something like instance of comment. Cool. Class, maybe, I think. So it should be an instance of the comment class and the actual. So we know it's an array now, so we can dereference it. We know it's an array with 1 item or element. So we should assert that, okay, that thing that we got back is a comment object. We'll just keep playing this down. So now, even further, we can say something like this, assert same and we'll do something else with this comment class. So if we go look at comment, we can actually get some information about what type of comment it was. So we can get the type, we can get its references, we can get its content. So we're just going to kind of test a lot of that now. Now, I'm not going to test the content per se, but I do want to make sure it's a warning comment, and I do want to make sure it has the paths. That's most important to me. If there's a typo or something in here, I'm not gonna, it's not gonna be the end of the world. So I'm not gonna test that today. So actual 0, we'll do get type. I do want to make sure that it is a comment warning, type warning. So there we go. And we can also do something like assert same on get, what was this? References, I think it was. References. I'm not getting any fun type hinting here. That's annoying. So we'll get references. Yes, we're good. And that should be, sorry, these are backwards again. So it's expected actual. Let's cut that, bring it over here. There we go, that's a little better. And in this case, the expected is really just going to be this same guy. I'm gonna go back and talk about a couple things here because I glossed over a few things, but let's run this test and hopefully watch it explode. And it just passes, which is a little scary. So again, let's break something. Let's change this to mail send. Okay, we get an exception now, no matching handler found. Okay, good. Let's have it return something else. And again, we wrote that test so perfectly that it all worked. There we go, good. Okay, so this is actually pretty cool. It returns a warning comment for the found instances. In this case, we did get some path back, but not that file one. So on mailables test line 58, the assertions weren't correct. So we can even go over here and change this, for example, to an info comment. Boom, failed asserting that 1 is identical to 2. Not a very good message, so we can actually control that in PHP unit by passing a third parameter. So in this case, expected a warning comment. So now we see something like expected a warning comment. So we could change that up if we wanted to. Again, lots of freedom with PHP unit, very robust testing framework. So another thing to demonstrate is if I were to call, for example, this twice, I should get, whoops, I don't get an error. So let's test for that. There's some cool things we can do in here. We can say something like once, or I think, yeah, once. So now when we change that up, it says, okay, hey, method event found usages of send should only be called 1 time instead of 2 times. So again, Mockery needs to clean up some of that error messaging. 1 times. Like it just, just little touches like that improve the developer experience, in my opinion. In fact, I also want to make sure that event isn't called in any other capacity, right? So let's just say I had some random thing here. Again, I'm still passing. So let's say something along the lines of should have received, we could go so far as to say this up here. So we could say, hey, look, event has only been called once and you were called. There might be a way to write this in 1 line. We'll mess with that in a second. So there we go, good. So it basically got called with any arguments more times than it should. So let's take that other one out. So I don't want to be logging things willy-nilly. Again, a little defensive. It's up to you if you want to write tests like that. It is important to me. I don't want extra analytics, so I'm going to test for that. Again, I didn't necessarily test for the exact bit here. I think that's going a little bit too far, and that's where people really start to harp on unit tests, and I think they make a fair point. As we see, this test is a little bit brittle, right? Like, if I came in here and started testing and changing things, like if I change this to an info comment, I care about that. If I came in here and added a little more to this, or if there was a typo or something, it's just not the end of the world to me, and I don't want the test to be that brittle. So again, it's about confidence. I'm confident at this point that this is, the essence of this task is doing the right thing. It's logging those analytics, and it's giving you a comment that, says something along the lines that I would want it to say. Hopefully, I'm not going to mess that up completely. But more importantly, it's giving you a warning comment to go back and review these particular paths that it found with that mail send. And that gives me enough confidence. I'm already pretty coupled to this behavior. I have to be calling find files. I have to be calling it with this very specific string to search for. I have to be logging this very particular analytics event. And that's fair because these things are important. I run reports on these analytics messages, so that matters. I have a very specific UX I want the user to see in the pull request, so that warning comment matters. Those paths matter. What I'm searching for is unlikely to change, right? This is an older version of the framework. That's not going to change anymore. So I'm okay with that coupling, but it's something that you might not be depending on your code. So give yourself a best chance to have tests that are a little bit flexible. So pay attention to things like that, because some people call that spell checking, and that's exactly what I would be doing literally if I had copied this over here and said something like assert same on get content is paste this content. I'm really just kind of checking line by line that these things are happening, and to some extent that's okay, but again, it's all about confidence. I'm confident enough that this test behaves the way I want right now with just these tests. Now these appear a little bit long, so I want to demonstrate one more thing. I'm going to open up with questions and direction here in just a minute, but let's refactor this, excuse me, just a little bit, because these tests are really doing a lot of the same things. The setup for a lot of these tests are the same. So just to give us a little bit more with PHP unit, let's create a public function. I think it's called setup. Yes, it is. So we're going to call parent. I think you always have to call parent. If you don't, there's some weird things that happen. And I do believe in my version of this, things have to be type hinted. Maybe not. Well, we'll fix that here in a second. So what I want to do is I actually want to pull some of these things up. And I want to set up a shift mock and all these mocks at kind of a high level and swap them out accordingly. So let's take all of this. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to put it up here, and I'm going to turn these into some instance variables. So let's say this subject, and we'll say this shift mock, and we'll say up here this log mock. And I actually don't want to call this mock anymore. We kind of are going to know what they are inside of this class. So let's change that. I'm not going to stub out this piece because that is test dependent. And we will change this to shift. Hello. Shift mock this. Shift mock. All right, PHP Storm. Not helpful on that one. I thought if you just type, oh, I don't have them set as properties yet. That's why it's not seeing them. So we'll do this log, and let's fix this green here by adding a field. And that's all good. That is a mailables. Let's add a field here. That's a mockery interface. And we'll add a field here. Not a property, jerk. And one more field. There we go. Cool. All right, so those should be set up now. We won't have to do this anymore. That's all going to be part of the swap, but we do need to change some of these instances here to be this log mock, and we will change shift mock to this shift. There we go. So everything's good, and then same thing down here. We can get rid of, we can get rid of subject as well, sorry. Let's change this to this subject. And I think it's important to refactor your tests as well, right? And notice I'm not changing my code right now. I'm strictly focused on the tests. So the code keeps my tests honest. The code kind of tests the test, and the test tests the code. They make this nice symbiotic relationship where you don't want to really be messing with that kind of harmony that's going on there. If I change both at the same time, I can potentially introduce a bug. So I'm really focused on just refactoring the tests, because the tests are code as well, and they deserve to be refactored. So we have this subject. I think that one's good. We can kill this line here. We're going to stub this out in a different way. So let's change that to this shift mock. And I don't need to swap it. I don't need to do any of this setup. I do need to change this subject. There you are. And we get actual from then on out, and we can just change this guy to this arrow log escape. All right, and let's run our tests. And again, didn't change anything, so we should all still be green. If it wasn't green, I would know that I introduced a bug strictly in my tests, and I could go back and fix that. And there we have it. That is testing. That's testing legacy code, if you will. And so now we're armed with some tests. We can perceive how it would be very easy now with the swap and so forth to be able to go back and test all sorts of those other things that we saw in the example, this Laravel Fixer test. No matter how involved they are at this point, we could do the same thing. So, there's configuration that we can change out here. There's other methods that shift gets called. We're actually getting into the file system here. So some of these would be a little bit interesting. And again, this is another opportunity. Maybe I turn this into, some kind of shift, get file or something like that, or file contents. And I just wrap that, file get contents under the cover. So I'm able to, again, manipulate this in my own ways. And so these would just all be things that I would go in and start messing with. We still have that log events. We have returning comments, very familiar code, very familiar structure. So I've already paved the way to be able to test more involved tasks, all the way up to where I got to something very involved like that request access, where it's finding multiple sets of files. It's JSON decoding stuff. It's doing a lot of string replacement. I could test these in a lot more capacity, a lot deeper capacity. And in fact, when I got this far, I would honestly consider an integration test because it doesn't make sense for me to start testing line by line here. What I would probably do is create a data fixture. I would swap out that file, return the contents of that data fixture, and basically let it parse it out and have kind of a before and after that I would test. And if you look at things like PHP unit itself, it actually does this underneath the covers. They have, for example, let me just kind of hint at that. They have a assert file equals. So we could do something very simple like that, where it was like, okay, this thing returns some kind of contents, or it put that, it put that file back out to the file system. So we could say something pretty easy like test fixtures. What was that? That was the request access, before.php was equal to, this same thing, right? But the after version. So this might be a good example of how, again, I could leverage PHP unit, but actually go ahead and drop in those fixtures and let it work on the actual file system a little bit. So I'm not, stubbing out entire long sections of it, even though this is some pretty involved code. An alternative would be maybe this gets broken out into yet another class, but ultimately I am going to have to test this code somewhere, no matter if I move the code around or not, to be able to mock it out or whatever. Eventually, I am going to have to test this code directly. And so I think crossing the bridge of this kind of partial integration test would be pretty interesting. So I'm not going to cover that today. Just kind of want to hint at the fact that armed with the swap and so forth, it really just becomes continuations of this game. And anything that's maybe not readily accessible, like accessing the file system, I can either wrap up inside of Shift, the Shift bot. Again, this static class that's doing everything. I'll test it directly over there with some very small fixtures. But here I'm able to kind of stub it out and do what I need to manipulate those contents very easily, right? So I'll open it up for questions here, but I think we'll just kind of end early because there's a lot jam-packed in there, and I don't want to exhaust us or future viewers. So we'll cut it off here, but do send across any questions. I'll just kind of clean up here with a nice little gitadd-p. And while I'm doing that, you all can send your questions across. So let me stop here, though. I'm actually going to bump PHP unit while we're waiting. So require --dev, and then let's bring in PHP. Hello, PHP unit. Got a little lag there, PHP unit. And we'll let that come across. Okay, good. I got some questions here. What do we have? Can you tell something about API testing? Yes. Can you be a little more specific? What are you interested in with API testing? Looks like Composer doesn't like conflicts with PHP unit mock objects. I'm not even using mock objects. Who uses that? All right, we're gonna manually fix this ourselves because I've seen this sometimes with like it gets stuck on um, its own dependency, which is very strange. I don't feel like it should do that. So let's do Composer update. Yeah, if you maybe reword your question just a little bit about API testing, I'm glad to kind of give you some hints. But it's kind of a broad question as it stands. So do you mean like how to test like the different endpoints, mock out certain pieces? What's the concern? All right, so Composer updated there. Don't know what that issue was. Let's go back and just make sure all of our tests still run, and then we'll finish our commit and call it done. So we have a failure now. Oh, I left something in there. So let's go back. Haha, my little example here is still in there. Cool. All right, we are green, which means I am comfortable making a commit. So let's do git add -p just to review the work. So I bumped the PHP unit version because I knew that was a little bit old, but everything still ran, so it's fine. I brought in Mockery for what we were doing today. We created that swap method, just a nice little one-liner, very straightforward, and then everything else was a new class. So let's just go ahead and add that explicitly. So test PHP unit, tasks, git status, everything looks good, so git commit. Let's see, test, mailables, so task, cool. And we are clean. Okay, let me try to answer some of these questions now. Yes, how to test the endpoints. Well, it really depends on the API test, right? If you're really trying to test the calls through to the different endpoints, then you might be interested in something more like an API test. I do know Postman, for example, has some tests you can write built into it, but those are definitely going to be integration tests or what some people might call end-to-end tests, because they're going to test all the way through, and because of that, you're going to have potentially a test database, test data, all sorts of stuff if you kind of test at that really, really high level through Postman. But that, again, as an old code base, I just want to mention it because that might be the easiest way to start. If not, I would probably try to get into the code and maybe, again, I would test things if you have controllers. I wouldn't necessarily test calling the endpoint all the way out at the surface. I might test that the proper route was set up, for example, like it's listening for a post request for the API. The controller is making sure the user's authenticated, things like that. And I think those would feel really similar to they would feel really similar to what we did today, where you would start stubbing out, mocking out different pieces to kind of manipulate the paths within the code to test all the different flow, right? All the different paths. So test that if you're not authenticated, you get a 401 or a 403 or whatever. So again, just some ideas off the top of my head, kind of with that. Can you give an example of something realistic a developer might do in the actual code? That would then cause the test to fail. With testing, I often find you're just rewriting the test to match whatever was added to the actual code, not what we might realistically catch in this instance. That's completely fair. I think it takes a little bit of time to kind of see that. I think on the surface, yeah, it does feel like something that's maybe a bit odd. So I tried to do that today a little bit when we went back with mailables, and I kind of like duplicated this line or something. So I'm not super defensive because the amount of code that I could write is infinite. I could put all sorts of different code inside of here that would do things that I didn't test for, to your point. So that's kind of what I was hinting at when I was saying things like, I don't really write a whole lot of defensive tests, and that's what I mean. But I will write them for things that I care about. So for example, that analytics, obviously that's you have to call this analytics thing just once. You can't call any other analytics event or this test would break, right? So, you know, if someone did come in here as a new developer eventually and say something like, you know, they changed this to found, you know, count, you know, whatever, and they did something like count pass, well, my code's going to fail now, right? Or the test's going to fail. So if you change something that's important in any way, then yes, this is actually, you know, legitimate test, right? So, you know, I tried to hint at that a little bit, but you do have a fair point. I don't let myself go there. Again, it's about confidence, not about paranoia. It's two sides of the same coin, if you will, but I try to keep it a little bit more positive than negative. I don't go in and test all the things I don't want to happen because that's a never-ending, infinite list. So I really just, again, I'm confidently testing for the things I care about so long as those are happening. If you happen to write this code in a different way, and it achieved those goals, then hey, that's fine. So I consider the test to be something where as long as these goals are met, you can write that implementation and you can do whatever else you want. And that's on me as the tester to make sure that those things are required. And I think to the point Axel made, that kind of reading ahead here, that's where TDD comes in, right? If I drove this out to do all the things I want, then at that point, anything else is kind of just gravy, and I'm cool with that. And ideally, I wrote the test in a way that gives a future developer a little bit of flexibility to maybe find a better way to write that code or other ways of other abstractions. And I'm not, you know, my tests aren't going to break. Now, again, we demonstrated that as well, how these might break. So makes sense. I think that line might be more clear with more experience. I don't have much. Yeah, and yeah, exactly. So again, hopefully when you rewatch this or watch some of those other workshops, you know, you'll kind of see where that comes into play. One example could be that you're testing a user to only see posts. So yeah, so exactly. Cool. Any other questions? I'll wait just one more second, get a quick drink here. Otherwise, feel free to continue these conversations in Slack. Hit me up on Slack. I'll have it running the rest of the day. As soon as Zoom finishes processing its cloud-based video, I will get this published on the workshop dashboard, so you can rewatch this. And I added downloads the other week, but I think there was an issue in Chrome or something to actually download the file so you can watch it on the go. So I'll try to fix that this afternoon as well, and I'll post back in Slack once those videos are ready. So last chance for real-time questions with the code. Otherwise, thank you all for attending. Again, definitely reach out in Slack, post on Twitter. Future workshops coming up are going to shift a little bit back towards Laravel. But again, if you enjoyed this, if you want to see more with testing, definitely send me some feedback. Again, I'm going to do a lot more of these in the fall, another kind of season of them, and you know, maybe we'll kind of extend this on those Refactor Friday videos as well. So I'll put all these in Slack to share. But again, thank you all for the questions, following along here, and I'll share this recording as soon as it's available. So see you all in Slack and on Twitter. Thank you all.